Today we're going to continue our discussion of the meaning of life, and let's sort of bring back to mind some of the points we made last time. So the main point of the last video was really just to introduce the concept of a meaningful life, to get us thinking about that a little bit, and to distinguish it from a happy or pleasurable life. And remember, one of the ways we did this was with the experience machine thought experiment. We said, well, okay, so imagine, this is Nozick's example. Imagine that you could have a machine that would allow you to simulate any set of experiences you want. I even added the additional idea that, well, let's say the machine could scan your brain, know exactly what set of experiences, what sort of life would bring you the most overall pleasure. The question that Nozick poses is, would you want to plug into the machine? And he thinks you wouldn't, and he thinks this shows that hedonism is false, because something other than pleasure must matter to you. He thinks those things are contact with reality, or being able to be free and in control of your actions and your lives, right? Being an autonomous individual. He thinks that pleasure is important, but we value those things even more than pleasure, so we wouldn't give them up just for maximum pleasure in our lives. Now, the reason this matters for us is because I think the experience machine is a good sort of gateway, or a good way to start thinking about the question of meaning. Because let's say you did decide to plug into the experience machine. Your entire life is simulated. You're living a very happy life from the inside, as Nozick says. Another question you could ask yourself is, even if I have the happiest, most pleasurable life, does my life matter? Is my life meaningful in any significant sense? Because one could answer, and this would be a controversial answer, but one could say at this point that even if you have a very happy life, you have a completely meaningless life. And if that's true, and I invite you to think more about whether you agree with that or not, but if that's in fact true, that means if you are concerned about living a life that matters, that living a life that's meaningful, it's going to take more than the pursuit of pleasure, even, I would suppose, even the higher pleasures. It's going to take more than just thinking about how to make oneself happy. And so it's with this in mind, that difference between happiness and meaning that I was really trying to bring out last time. It's with this in mind that I want to jump today into Richard Taylor's article, The Meaning of Life. So there's really three main points that Taylor wants to establish in this article. First, he wants to give a definition of what he thinks is the fundamental characteristic of meaninglessness, right? So basically wants to outline what would it mean to live a life that completely lacks any meaning at all. Okay, so he does that. He identifies that core characteristic of meaninglessness. Then, once he's done that, perhaps depressingly, he argues that this characteristic of meaninglessness applies to all biological life, including human life. So whatever it is we think that would make a life completely pointless, completely meaningless, he thinks characterizes human life. But, and this is his third conclusion, this third point he wants to make, despite that fact, he still thinks that there is a way in which we can say that humans live meaningful lives, although perhaps not quite in the way we might expect. Okay, so let's start with the first point he wants to make. This idea that he wants to establish what does it mean to live a meaningless life. And here's how he explains what he's going to do. He says, if the idea of meaningfulness is difficult to grasp in this context, so that we are unsure of what sort of thing would amount to answering the question, the idea of meaninglessness is perhaps less so. So he says, well, meaningfulness, that's a difficult question. But he says, I think we can get an easier grasp on what a meaningless life is. And he says, if then we can bring before our minds a clearer image of a meaningless existence, then perhaps we can take a step forward, a step toward coping with our original question by seeing to what extent our lives, as we actually find them, resemble that image. Okay, so he's looking for an image of meaninglessness. What is the image that he uses? So here, Taylor appeals to this ancient myth of Sisyphus. This is it's a story that's been told in a number of different ways and in different places. But this is Taylor's recounting of it. So he says, a perfect image of meaninglessness of the kind we're seeking is found in the ancient myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, it will be remembered, betrayed divine secrets to mortals, and for this he was condemned by the gods to roll a stone to the top of a hill. The stone then immediately rolled back down again to be pushed to the top by Sisyphus, to roll down once more, and so on, again and again, forever. So here's the picture that he's painting, right? We have this guy, Sisyphus. He's condemned by the gods to roll this stone up the mountain. Once he gets to the top, it comes back down. He goes back to the top, back down, back to the top, back down, forever and ever, for all eternity. Now, he thinks this is the sort of perfect image of meaninglessness. He says, now in this, we have the picture of meaningless, pointless toil, of a meaningless existence that is absolutely never redeemed. He says his repetitive toil is his life and reality, and it goes on forever, and it is without any meaning whatever. Nothing ever comes of what he's doing except simply more of the same. Not by one step, nor by 1,000, nor by 10,000 does he even expiate the smallest token of sin against the gods. So it's not like the gods were punishing him, and if he just rolled the stone up the hill enough times, he would finally, have served his time, have gotten rid of his sins. No, they just said, you have to roll this stone up and down the hill forever. Nothing comes of it, nothing at all. Okay, so a few things. Taylor believes you'll agree at this point that the life that Sisyphus leads in this little story is meaningless. The question is, why? What is it about this life that is meaningless? What is it about this life which seems so pointless? And Taylor explains it in the following way. He says, well, from this story, we can determine the defining characteristic of meaninglessness. It's repetitious, cyclical activity that never comes to anything. So another way of putting it, a completely meaningless life would be one where you do the same thing over and over and over again to no point in purpose. And he has a couple of other nice examples that I think really get this point across. I'll read through the second one. He says, we can imagine two groups of prisoners, one of them engaged in digging a prodigious hole in the ground that is no sooner finished than it is filled in again by the other group. The latter then digging a new hole that is once filled in by the first group, and so on endlessly. And of course, at this point, this might bring to mind our discussion from the previous video about bullshit jobs. Because, this is a prisoner he's talking about, but it's certainly a sort of very pointless labor. You're literally digging a hole to have it filled in by someone else. You can imagine, for instance, another sort of image of perhaps an administrator coming up with documents and forms that are then put to that person's subordinates to be filled out to no point in purpose, to then produce more documents to be filled out to, again, no point in purpose for all of eternity, right? So what ties all these images together is this sense that engaging in the same sort of activity for a long period of time, maybe forever, for which it's not clear why we're doing it in the first place. All right, so this is what he thinks is the defining characteristic of meaninglessness. Now, one thing to think about here is, notice in his definition, he has these two parts, repetitious, cyclical activity that never comes to anything. So those two parts. And one thing to think about is this first part really necessary for a meaningless life? Does it actually matter? So if you go back to Sisyphus, does it actually matter that he's doing the same thing over and over again? That undoubtedly that makes his life more boring. But if instead, if the gods had given him a multitude of different tasks to do, none of which served any purpose other than just, they were forcing him to do it, we might wonder whether that would be a meaningful life, or whether that life would have any more meaning. And Taylor seems to suggest, in fact, that it wouldn't, right? One of the things he points out is that when you think about Sisyphus, one of the things you probably think about, oh my God, that would be horrible. I'm pushing a boulder up a very large mountain for long periods of time. How tired would I be? How much my muscles would be aching? How much pain I would be undergoing? It sounds awful. And how bored I would be, for sure. But that's all true, but Taylor says that's not really why we think this is a meaningless existence. He says what stands out in all such pictures as oppressive and dejecting is not that the beings who enact these roles suffer any torture or pain, nor is it that their labors are great. So, if you go back to the example of digging holes in the ground, right? That's not like labor way beyond the sort of things that people do. He had another example where he talked about people engaging in a relay race where they just pass a precious stone back and forth and do it for all eternity. That's not a great struggle. It's not great labor. But it's still, the work seems completely pointless. And he says it's not even the fact that Sisyphus' labors continue forever that deprives him of their meaning. Again, that would make him more boring and makes him more toilsome, but that's not really the problem. Rather, he says, it is rather the implication of this, that these labors come to nothing. Ultimately, what Taylor thinks is really the defining characteristic of meaninglessness is just an activity that has no point, no purpose, no true end that's worth accomplishing. At this point, one question you might want to ask yourself, and it is a question that Taylor does ask himself, are there any ways we could change the story about Sisyphus, which might make it such that Sisyphus would be leading a meaningful life? Maybe not an enjoyable life, maybe not a life we would love to have, but for all that, maybe still a meaningful life. And in fact, Taylor gives two different modifications of the story to bring about different ways in which Sisyphus might ultimately lead a meaningful life, if we change the story up a little bit. So, here's the first modification. He says, but if we suppose that these stones, instead of rolling back to their places as if they had never been moved, were assembled at the top of a hill and they're incorporated, say, in a beautiful and enduring temple, then the aspect of meaninglessness would disappear. So first, he says, originally we imagined Sisyphus just rolling the stone up the hill for no reason, but let's say the god said, you gotta roll all these stones up the hill because eventually they'll come together, they'll be used to construct this beautiful and enduring temple. You can imagine this takes a very long time. You can imagine it's not enjoyable. You can imagine it's painful and there's a lot of suffering. Once we put a point and purpose at the end of our actions, then it seems like we're starting to say, okay, well, this suffering, this pain I'm going through is worth it. There's at least something at the end of this that I'm trying to do. So that'd be one way to change up the story, and it seems like it might give Sisyphus a meaningful existence. Taylor also considers a second modification of the story. Right? It's perhaps not something you might think of initially. So he says, let us suppose that the gods, while condemning Sisyphus to the fate just described, at the same time, as an afterthought, wax perversely merciful by implanting in him a strange and irrational impulse, namely a compulsive impulse to roll stones. So now what are we imagining? Same situation as before. Here's Sisyphus rolling the stones up the hill, them rolling back down. The gods have ordered him to do this, but in the way that Taylor puts it, they did something that's perversely merciful. They implanted him this weird desire just to roll stones for the rest of his life. So as he's doing this, even if it's, again, painful and difficult, he's saying, rolling stones is great. I'm having so much fun. This is the one thing that I'm obsessed with. And in this case, notice we're not even imagining that there's some great enduring temple that Sisyphus is rolling these stones up the mountain to build. He's just rolling because he likes to roll the stones, and that's pretty much it. One of the interesting things about this modification of the original story is that Taylor says the gods waxed perversely merciful. And this might be your reaction when you think about, if you were to ask yourself, okay, in virtue of giving Sisyphus this desire, were the gods merciful to him? Did they benefit him? Did they help him? Or did they do something perverse? Did they do something misguided? Did they do something that didn't benefit him at all, that really harmed him? And there's a sense in which it might seem like either, right? I mean, if he has this desire to roll the stones, you might say, well, that's better for him. Now he's enjoying what he's doing. And that seems like a good thing. At the same time, Sisyphus has fundamentally been brainwashed. His desires have been totally changed around from what they would normally be. The only reason he likes rolling these stones so much is because the gods have programmed him to like them. And this is sort of worth thinking about, because this can be seen as a metaphor for human life in general. If you're engaging in some activity that you really enjoy, it's satisfying one of your desires. To make that activity meaningful, is it enough that you just want to do it, that you like to do it, that you enjoy it? Or do we say, well, is that a good desire to fulfill? Is that a worthwhile activity in and of itself? And so it's that conflict that I think is the reason Taylor is going to say that this is a perversely merciful action. It's merciful because it seems to let him enjoy what he's doing, but it's perverse and then it's a sort of weird brainwashing. Okay, so, but in any case, we have these two different modifications. And he gives a little more explanation of this second modification, because he wants to really, this is going to be very important for him. In the second modification, where the gods have simply given him this desire to roll stones, notice he says exactly the same things happen as before. The only change is in Sisyphus' view of them. The only thing that has happened is this. Sisyphus has been reconciled to it, to rolling the stones, and indeed more, he has been led to embrace it, not however by reason or persuasion, but by nothing more rational than the potency of a new substance in his veins. So here's another way to think about the point Taylor's trying to make, or the question really he's trying to bring up. If you're engaging in an activity in your life that you find toilsome, boring, that seems to you to be pointless in a certain way, could that activity be made meaningful if you just changed your view of the situation? If you engage in some sort of meditative practice where you reconciled yourself to your life, if you were brainwashed, if somehow you were able to change your desires so that you desire doing the things you're doing right now, and none of your activities changed. All your activities were as repetitive, as boring, as pointless as they ever were. Right? Again, the example of a bullshit job is just a perfect example to plug in here. You're doing all the same things as before. Can you make your life meaningful just by looking at it a different way? Just by somehow trying to encourage yourself to have a passion for the things you're already doing. And the reason this really matters is because it brings to light one of the major distinctions to get from this lesson, that there seem to be two different types of meaning. On the one hand, we have what we might call objective meaning. So this is a type of meaning that would come from you just doing things that are inherently valuable. So if you, and to a certain extent, this is what I think Mill is trying to get at with the higher pleasures, right? So you solve a difficult math problem, you engage in philosophical reflection, you understand beauty, you accomplish something very difficult in the athletic realm, which takes a lot of training. You form a great friendship, right? You're there for someone you love. All of these actions are the sort of actions that we think are just valuable in themselves, no matter what anyone else thinks of them. There's something objectively important about these things. And so that might be one type of meaning that we want, that maybe our lives could give us. But sometimes we talk about meaning in a different way, in a subjective sense. And subjective meaning comes not really from the importance of the activities you engage in, but what you think about those activities. It comes from how you view those activities. Is it something you enjoy? Is it something that feels important to you? To use Nozick's language from the Experience Machine, subjective meaning might be more about how you live your life from the inside. Another way to think about this difference between objective and subjective meaning is this. So think about some of the example, and we'll come back to the Experience Machine in a minute, but think about some of the examples that we've looked at so far. We can explain these in terms of, in these cases, does the person have objective meaning, subjective meaning, both, neither? So think about the original story of Sisyphus. The very first version I told you without any modifications. Is his life objectively meaningful? It seems not, right? There's no valuable goal to be gained by rolling the stones up the hill. Is it subjectively meaningful? Well, no, he doesn't enjoy it either. It's just pain and suffering and toil and boredom. So the original Sisyphus story seems to be one in which there can't be any sort of meaning. What about the two modifications? So think about the modification where we imagine Sisyphus is rolling the stones up the hill in order to build a beautiful temple. Well, now it still seems like his life doesn't have subjective meaning necessarily, right? I mean, it depends on the details of the case, but you can imagine Sisyphus saying something like, well, I don't really care that much about this beautiful temple. It's not how I would like to spend my time. I was also forced into doing this by the gods, so it's not something that fulfills me personally. But he might be able to recognize, say, well, this is an activity that's objectively meaningful. If I roll the stones up the hill, that contributes to there being a little more beauty in the world, and that's a good thing. So that modification seems to be a case where a life has objective meaning but not subjective. And consider the case of John Stuart Mill we talked about last time. You'll remember we talked about the case from his autobiography, where Mill essentially says, I have all these, great goals, these great ambitions. I want to make the world a better place. I want to make the world more free, more equal, etc. And then eventually when he imagines himself doing all those things, he finds it doesn't fulfill him. And I think this is a similar sort of case, right? Because making the world more free, more equal, more just, more happy, we might say these are objectively meaningful things. Making the world a better place is objectively good. But it wasn't satisfying to him. It wasn't fulfilling to him. It wasn't something that, he found he had any passion for. This is what caused him to fall into the depression. And so it would seem to lack subjective meaning. And then, so let's also consider the second modification. The one where Sisyphus has been given this strange impulse and desire to roll stones. Now, the activity is still just as objectively meaningless as it ever was. It's not, the stones aren't going to build some great temple. They're just going to be rolled up and down for all eternity. But because he has this very weird impulse to do that thing, we might say his life has subjective meaning. Okay, so first you can see that these two things can come apart. We might say a life has objective meaning, subjective meaning, maybe both or neither. That's the first distinction to keep in mind. Now, so what Taylor eventually does is he says, well, let's look at human life in a realistic way from the point of view of objective meaning. And the first thing he does is now he says we have the defining characteristic of objective meaning. If human life is objectively meaningful, then it must be the opposite of endless pointlessness, and it must have some significant culmination. Right? Another way to think about this is, which two modifications of the Sisyphus story best captures the nature of human life? Is our life more like the myth of Sisyphus, where there's some significant culmination at the end where we labor and struggle and do all sorts of things, and then there's finally a significant goal we achieve at the very end? Or is our life more like the second modification of Sisyphus, where we do a whole bunch of pointless stuff? We do a whole bunch of stuff with no end, no significant culmination. We build a lot of things that are ultimately going to be destroyed, but we're very obsessed with doing it. Although nothing we do has any significant endpoint, nothing we do will last or endure forever, we are, at least in the moment, very passionate about doing it, and we care a great deal about it. So which of these two is our life like? Now, the way Taylor wants to approach this is he's going to say that human life, and in fact all biological life, is completely objectively meaningless. He's going to have some things to say about subjective meaning, but from an objective point of view, he's going to say our lives are objectively meaningless. And he's not going to start with human beings. He's going to start with other forms of biological life. So he has this example of these glowworms in New Zealand. So let's see what he has to say about these. He says, thus, for example, there are caves in New Zealand, deep and dark, whose floors are quiet pools and whose walls and ceilings are covered with soft light. As you gaze and wonder in the stillness of these caves, it seems that the Creator has reproduced there in microcosm the heavens themselves until you scarcely remember the enclosing presence of the walls. So here's what he's talking about. It really is quite a sight. Here is a picture of these glowworms in New Zealand. And when you look at it in this way, it's beautiful. It's almost breathtaking to see this sort of sight when you look at it from a distance. But then he says, as you look more closely, however, the scene is explained. Each dot of light identifies an ugly worm whose luminous tail is meant to attract insects from the surrounding darkness. As from time to time one of these insects draws near it, it becomes entangled in a sticky thread lowered by the worm and is eaten. This goes on month after month, the blind worm lying there in the barren stillness waiting to entrap an occasional bit of nourishment that will only sustain it to another bit of nourishment until what? What great thing awaits all this long and repetitious effort and makes it worthwhile? Really nothing. And he goes on to explain how this cycle continues. These adults, as soon as they have mated and laid eggs, are themselves caught in threads and devoured by the cannibalist worms, often without having ventured into the day, the only point to their existence now having been fulfilled. What is the point he's trying to make here? We see this beautiful scene. We see this arresting scene of the glowworms in this cave in New Zealand. But when you look closer at what's actually going on, just an endless cycle of being born, growing, only to be eventually cannibalized. And this goes on forever. This whole biological cycle just reproduces itself generation after generation after generation. And this is exactly the sort of cycle that you see in all biological life. He says all living things present essentially the same spectacle. The larva of a certain cicada burrows into the darkness of the earth for 17 years, through season after season, to emerge finally in the daylight for a brief flight, lay its eggs and die. This all to repeat itself during the next 17 years, and so on to eternity. So the cicada, right, underground for 17 years, hatches up, only to die, to bury its eggs again, to do this 17 years later, again and again and again. The birds fly south, only to fly back, every single season, over and over and over again, right? So he looks at all these examples of biological life and says you see the same sort of cyclical, repetitious pattern of biological life doing the same thing over and over again to essentially no point and purpose. And of course, the reason this matters is because this represents or resembles what we said was the defining characteristic of meaninglessness. It actually very much resembles what we saw with Sisyphus. He says, then you realize there's no point to it at all, that it really culminates in nothing, that each of these cycles so filled with toil is to be followed only by more of the same. The point of any living thing's life is evidently nothing but life itself. So we have generation 1, which produces generation 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and just goes on to eternity. And remember, we said a meaningful life has a significant culmination. So where is the significant culmination here? Where is the final end? Where is the important purpose that these forms of biological life are supposed to be producing? It seems they're essentially doing nothing but producing themselves over again, of causing the same cycle to occur. And again, one way to look at this, which is a topic we brought up to some extent in the previous video, is to think about through the lens of parenthood. Just like any other form of biological life, if every human generation is also just being born, reproducing and sacrificing for the next generation so they can do the exact same thing, then where is all this going? And that's what Taylor says. He says, this life of the world thus presents itself to our eyes as a vast machine, feeding on itself, running on and on forever to nothing. And of course, we are part of that life. Why does all of that matter? What does all this mean? It means that our lives are very much like Sisyphus. He thinks the original story of the myth of Sisyphus, actually, and probably the second modification, where Sisyphus was sort of obsessed with rolling stones, very much represents our actual lives. He says, we toil after goals, most of them, indeed every single one of them, of transitory significance. And having gained one of them, we immediately set forth to the next. So think about this. You probably have goals to graduate college, maybe attain gainful employment, find long-lasting, loving relationships, or maybe just collect stamps, whatever you want to do. But we have all sorts of series of goals which guide and direct our actions. And once we accomplish one of these goals, we just move on to the next, to the next, to the next. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, how significant are any of these goals, these things I achieve? Do any of them qualify as a significant culmination of human life? Taylor says, and if we think that, unlike Sisyphus, these labors do have a point in that they culminate in something lasting and independently of our own deep interest in them, very worthwhile, then we simply have not considered the thing closely enough. So think about anything you're trying to pursue. Think about anything the human race as a whole is trying to pursue. Is there any sense in which you would say that those things matter in and of themselves? Is there any sense in which you would say that those things would be important even if no human being cared about them? Most of the projects you probably pursue, you might admit, wouldn't really matter that much if you didn't care about them. If you didn't desire them, then it would be fine to drop them. They don't have so much inherent value. So why would it be different for the human race as a whole. Any good that human beings are trying to pursue that we're doing as a collective, if we all just decide it was not very important anymore, then it's not clear that whatever that goal is would necessarily have its own inherent worth. And so he thinks that human life is very much just like the life of the cicadas, the life of the glowworms. Everyone's life thus resembles one of Sisyphus' climbs to the summit of his hill, and each day of it one of his steps. The difference is that whereas Sisyphus himself returns to push the stone up again, we leave this to our children. So over the whole vast life of the human species, every step along the way, every generation, right, is kind of like one of Sisyphus' steps up the hill. Or maybe we'll say one of his climbs up the hill. And whereas, each generation dies out and doesn't finish the task, whatever that is, we just leave it to our children. We leave it to the next generation, who leave it to the next generation. So for that reason, he's going to say that human life is objectively meaningless. There is no final, significant culmination to the things we do. It is very much a cyclical, repetitious cycle.